A lot of people talk about who they'd want to meet from the Bible. And of course, there's the biggies. We'd love to meet Jesus, go back to see the life of Jesus, or Peter, the Apostle Paul, and the list goes on, Barnabas. One of the people, or a couple, that I would love to meet would be Aquila and Priscilla. In the whole narrative of how bold leaders start house church networks and the impact these house churches have had on building Christianity, Aquila and Priscilla, if we look closely at the text in the history of that day, see, here is a couple who makes a big difference. Today, I want to talk about Aquila and Priscilla and give us a taste of what a couple sold out for Christ can do in the house church movement. So, who are Aquila and Priscilla? Let's talk about this early church leader's story. Now, first of all, a partnership in the gospel is made with this couple. They may have founded the Corinth church together with the Apostle Paul. Paul lived with them about 18 months, theologians and scholars and commentaries talk about. So in Acts 18, verse 1 and 3, we are introduced. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius, this is the great emperor Claudius, had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. So there's sort of like a little bit of I wouldn't call it a martyrdom type of persecution, but there is definitely religious persecution going on, so they're expelled from Rome. Paul went to see them, that's Aquila and Priscilla, because he was a tent maker as they were. He stayed and worked with them. So the first thing that happens here is, here they are believers. Paul meets Aquila, but then there's an enterprise connection. So Paul, who is a tent maker, and Priscilla and Aquila, who are tent makers, together connect. I think about this as one of the most inspirational things when it comes to Christian Leaders Institute and where we are today. So what are we interested in? A lot of times people will say, well, what's the theme of Christian Leaders Institute? Who's your audience? Who are you trying to reach? And I say, our theme is the Apostle Paul. Paul is a tent maker, and Paul is a ministry leader. And there's a bivocational aspect to him. He is a deacon, a minister of the gospel. And the Apostle Paul is also someone who earns his own salary. And I think to myself, and I reflect on this, what if Christian Leaders Institute, what if our primary goal and vision were to raise up bivocational leaders and help them to get all the ministry training they need for free so they're well equipped? And what if we were to also give enterprise? So this year, we're introducing the Christian Leaders Enterprise Program so that, just like the Apostle Paul, we have tent makers and we have ministry trained leaders. So I'm excited about this day, the partnership. And we see that partnership first seen right here in building the Corinth church together. But it goes farther than that. In Acts 18, verse 18 through 20, Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. Then he left the brothers and sailed for Syria. Now notice what happens next. Accompanied by this married team, Priscilla and Aquila. Before he sailed, he had his hair cut off at Cenchrea. Now, Cenchrea is a port not far from Corinth, sort of a connected port there. There's a church in Cenchrea, a house church there as well. Anyway, he has his hair cut off because of a vow he had taken. They arrived at Ephesus, where Paul left Priscilla and Aquila. Now, this is no small thing. He leaves Priscilla and Aquila, who are going to plant a house church in Ephesus. He himself went into the synagogues, reasoned with the Jews, and they asked him to spend more time with them. He declined. We read about Priscilla and Aquila's house church in Ephesus. 1 Corinthians 16, verse 19, the Apostle Paul is writing to the Corinthians, and they say that this letter is written in Syria, so he's on his way, so he writes back. The churches in the province of Asia send you greetings. Aquila and Priscilla greet you warmly in the Lord. So does the church that meets in their home. All the brothers here send you greeting. Okay, so I said he went into Syria. I want to correct that. He wrote this in Ephesus. So that's what theologians say. So what's happened is, notice, Aquila and Priscilla they have planted with Paul the church in Corinth. So now they leave Corinth for Ephesus. There's a house church in Ephesus. So who's with the Apostle Paul at the house church but Aquila and Priscilla? Now again, these are all historical details, but they matter, because what you see here is you see the base of the Apostle Paul in some of these missionary journeys is becoming the house church, and now he has a winner couple, Aquila and Priscilla, participating. So now Aquila and Priscilla, get this now, are in Ephesus. They have a house church. So we read in Acts 18, 24 through 26. Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the Scripture. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and taught about Jesus accurately, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained him the way of God more adequately. So, get this picture. Now we have in Ephesus a launching house church. That's right. The Apollos is a great guy. He knows about Jesus. And somewhere along the line, he ends up back in Ephesus, and there's a connection. But who disciple him in a more fuller understanding of the gospel? It's Priscilla and Aquila. So this couple is now impacting the life of Apollos. Apollos becomes such a leader in the early church that in the book of Corinthians 2, people even, the Apostle Paul says, some follow Apollos, I follow Paul, I follow Peter, Cephas, and all of those things. Now, the point being is, this is a guy who really knew how to lead. And here, Priscilla and Aquila, in their house church, are giving him a more full understanding of the gospel. Well, what happens next? Apollos trained at their little ministry center, their little Christian Leaders Institute, so to speak, their little mentor center, and what happens next? When Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, the brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples and there to welcome him. On arriving, he was a great help to those by grace who had believed, for he vigorously refuted the Jews in public debate, proving from scriptures that Jesus was the Christ. So here's a house church in Ephesus, giving Apollos more training, then sends him out, and I believe, and again, we're not there to know with 100% certainty, but I believe that Priscilla and Aquila and the brothers wrote a letter that they were recommending. Hey, they've been with Apollos, he's a great guy, and that's what house churches do. Everybody gets to know each other. When you're in a house church, you're going to get to know each other. So they sent a letter sending and commending Apollos for ministry. So this is an example of a courageous apostolic leaders. These courageous apostolic leaders, after Claudius is no longer the emperor, Aquila and Priscilla somehow find themselves back in Rome. And then we read in the book of Romans, written by the Apostle Paul, in Romans 16, verse 3 and 5, greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ. They risked their lives for me. Not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful to them. Greet also the church that meets in their home. Okay, I just want to talk about this. Okay, so Romans chapter 16, verse 1 and 2, he starts the chapter out by basically saying, okay, well, here's Phoebe, a deacon. She's going to tell you about this letter. If you need help, honor her, commend her. She's a pro istemi. She's a great leader, and accept her and accept this letter. Okay. Then comes the next section where Paul's talking about Aquila and Priscilla. And he's talking about brave leaders who risked their lives. All the Gentile churches, these house churches all over, are grateful for their work. So these are people who started a house church in Corinth, built a house church in Ephesus. When they went back to Rome, built another house church. And now they're in Rome. There's a movement of Christianity in Rome. This is pretty amazing. Oh, but it even goes farther. So now what happens, years pass. And the Apostle Paul is now in prison in Rome, and shortly he is going to lose his life. Aquila and Priscilla are not even in Rome, so they're not at a house church there in Rome anymore, and they're back in Ephesus. So what does the Apostle Paul say? He says in 2 Timothy 1:16, he talks about this interesting Onesiphorus situation, and it connects, by the way, to Priscilla and Aquila, and I'll show you in a minute. So, may the Lord show mercy to the household of Onesiphorus, because he often refreshed me. It was not ashamed of my chains. On the contrary, he was in Rome. When he was in Rome, he searched hard for me until he found me. May the Lord grant that he will find mercy from the Lord on that day. You know very well how many ways he helped me in Ephesus. Okay, then toward the very end of the book, right at the end, after Paul says, I fought the good fight, I finished the faith, we see Aquila, Priscilla and Aquila, this couple mentioned again. Greet Priscilla and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Now, what is all that about? Okay, so these are bold leaders. These are leaders in the house church movement in Ephesus. And what commentaries talk about, and people who study this in depth believe that Onesiphorus had been martyred at this point. It showed mercy to the household of Onesiphorus. There was a persecution going on, and Onesiphorus is no longer there. He has died. Maybe he was martyred, maybe he just died. But one thing we see is that Paul mentions mercy, and even when it goes on, like in 2 Timothy, Paul says that I will not be ashamed, but I know who I have believed, and am persuaded that he is able to keep what I have entrusted unto that day. And now in that same theme, that same song almost, what we see is Paul wishes that on Onesiphorus. He's not praying for the dead here. He's just saying that Onesiphorus is a bold, brave leader who gave his life and everything for the Lord, okay? And the household is still there, and he wants them to be blessed. And whose house church are they with? They're again with Priscilla and Aquila. Now, the point I want to make in this all is years have passed. Years have passed since the first household church in Corinth and Ephesus. And in this time, there was another household church in Rome, and Priscilla and Aquila are a part of that. And you can see this network of connection that late now in Paul's life, Priscilla and Aquila are back supporting a house church and families in a house church that were founded, decades earlier. To me, this is an example of how this house church movement was going deep. So, I want to comment now on some, to me, interesting possible ahas about this whole story. I mean, the whole Priscilla and Aquila and house church network story. The first that I think is so interesting, 4 epistles are connected to Aquila and Priscilla. Corinthians, Ephesians, there's 2 books written to the Corinthians, Ephesians, and Romans. Now, to me, that's pretty incredible. I mean, okay, I don't know if you guys have sort of a biblical fantasy life. Oh, some people think I should get help from a psychologist. I do. I have a biblical fantasy life. And I don't want the life to be not biblical. I want it to be biblical. But I put myself in that early church scenario. I want to be a character there too. I want that culture to influence me so much in my own leadership today. So if I just think a little bit on all of these incredible facts about this story, and one fact is that Priscilla and Aquila are connected to the Apostle Paul, connected to letters written to house churches, churches like Ephesus or the Ephesians, and letters, epistles written to the Corinthians and to Rome. And in that Roman one, they're the first people mentioned after the introduction of Phoebe. When I look at that and I think that, okay, so Paul writes to the Romans and the letter is being carried by Phoebe from Cenchrea, which is near Corinth, so this is where the letter is written, and where once upon a time Priscilla and Aquila were also part of the leadership team in Corinth. They all kind of know each other. There's this whole incredible relational bank going on here. So then the letter is delivered, and it could have been delivered, listen to this, to Priscilla and Aquila's home church. Maybe that's where it was opened up. So now I'm picturing their home. Phoebe comes there with the letter, brings it to Priscilla and Aquila, and that's how the letter gets introduced to the Roman believers. Now, can I prove this? No. This is again, but isn't it interesting that these letters are all connected? Okay, here's another possible interesting aha for me. There's another epistle that may have a connection to Priscilla and Aquila. People have said, who wrote Hebrews? And the traditional understanding for the first, for many, many centuries was that that's the Apostle Paul. But then theologians and scholars, they look at the Greek and they look at the writing style, they look at the topics and whether there's some similarity to some of the epistles. People have said, they don't think so. And one of the leading evaluations and conclusions is that Apollos wrote the book of Hebrews. Because they say that because the Greek in the book of Hebrews is similar to Alexandrian Greek. Apollos is from Alexandria. It's that type of conclusions that people talk about. Now, again, we won't know till heaven some of these answers. But a possible aha for me is I'm in the story, I'm in the narrative. You know, if somebody says, who do you think wrote the book of Hebrews? I would say, I think Apollos did. Well, look at these facts of the story. Apollos is a great guy. He knew the baptism of John. He meets Priscilla and Aquila. They, in their little mentor center ministry school, train Apollos in the deeper, in the more fuller expression of the gospel. And he, later on, goes to write the book of Hebrews. Whoa. This is a powerful, incubating house church that not only sends Apollos on, but it also gives him the wherewithal in the Lord that he eventually writes the book of Hebrews. I have no need to try to prove this because I can't. This happened 2,000 years ago. But the facts are all there. And to me, in my imagination, my biblically informed imagination, it's aha for me. Number 3. Now this one is not even speculation. This is a married couple in the house church ministry. Okay, a married couple in the house church ministry. I remember when my wife, Pam, and I were called into the ministry, we believed it was a calling together. What I'm so excited about at Christian Leaders Institute, a lot of pastors' wives are taking Christian Leaders Institute classes to prepare themselves for ministry. To me, if the Christian Leaders Institute inspired aspect of the house church movement could be something really cool, and it's going to be, I believe. But an added, I'm not saying this probably the best way right now, but what I would be excited about is that if somebody were 50 years from now say, all these house church leaders were raised up through the ordination of house church leaders at Christian Leaders Institute, and now they're writing history books 100 years from now, I'm gone, and they say one of the characteristics of this movement was that it was a couple movement. Husband and wives, wives and husbands. That is pretty amazing. Couples. It's interesting to me, and I think this is another interesting point, is Priscilla and Aquila are mentioned 6 times by name in the Bible. 3 times they're named Priscilla and Aquila. The other 3 times they're named Aquila and Priscilla. So it's Aquila and Priscilla 3 times, and Priscilla and Aquila the other 3 times. It's as if they're interchangeable. It's as if when, for instance, Apollos comes to learn in Ephesus, it's written Priscilla and Aquila. When they first meet, it's in Corinth, it's mentioned Aquila and Priscilla. The very last time when the Apostle Paul mentions, as he in 2 Corinthians is being poured out like a drink offering, he says Priscilla and Aquila. Now, I know that's really confusing to listen to, but the word order in Greek matters, and they were a couple in ministry. In my president's office, my wife, she works in the mornings in my office, and I've now decided to name my office the Aquila and Priscilla office, president's office, in my mind. So if you come to visit, you come to the president's office, maybe I'll get a little sign or something, the Aquila and Priscilla's president's office. Because I know that my wife, who does my proofreading, many of you know I'm dyslexic, so many of you know I get sometimes words turned around and everything. I have my Priscilla to help me. And I believe that's going to be the case in these house church movement. I mean, to me, just the thought of couple ministry is powerful. Number 4, another aha out of this is we have a bivocational connection, which connects so closely to Christian Leaders Institute. Enterprise with the Apostle Paul. Aquila and Priscilla, the Apostle Paul, there's an enterprise zone here. There's an enterprise zone where in this whole early church, bivocational leaders, tent makers, and ministry leaders are planting house churches. And then I think about you. Most of you are bivocational. And you've got a job, you've got your life, and yet you have ministry. And this ministry is going forward, and you sense the call. And what makes Christian Leaders Institute so much an opportunity for you is because the classes are free. And if you want some verification, there's some donations for certificates, and there's, if you want a bachelor's degree, there's a fee, but very small. No one's going in debt if you want the official degree. But all of the training is free. It goes everywhere free, so that bivocational leaders can get everything they need for ministry. I know that makes me pretty excited, and I see this pattern in the early church. Here's another thing. Long-term relationships spanning years of ministry. If you think about when the Apostle Paul and Priscilla and Aquila meet, and people speculate on the dates, but somewhere possibly 48 or so, or 43, some people, so let's say in the 40s. And then 60-something or so when Nero comes and Paul. So now let's say it's 18, 20 years. In this ministry span, you see this team is together. And that's how I see the house church movement being our participation, Christian Leaders Institute participation, Christian Leaders Alliance participation. It's a long-term commitment. It's about passing it on to our children even. It's about seeing how God is blessing our country and how we're all connected. When Aquila and Priscilla go back to Ephesus. They're in Rome, they go back to Ephesus, and they're with Onesiphorus, and you have all of those things that are occurring. To me, that's powerful stuff. And I believe we're going to be part of that as well. Now, one more thing. You see in this couple the clear role for Priscilla, a woman who is involved with her husband in teaching Apollos. It was mentioned before her husband 3 times. That is notable. Here we have an instance, and again, people wonder about women in office and all of that, and we understand that it's okay to ordain a woman as a deacon, a man as a deacon. They're ministers of the gospel, they're doers. And I know that there's much debate about the role of elder, and we're going to actually talk about the role of elder and some of those things later in this class. At Christian Leaders Institute, not to be an offense, we say, okay, we are going to be, this movement is about clergy, house church clergy, ordained leaders like Priscilla who are out there planting churches. We love the fact that Priscilla is with her husband, so we see the headship principle operating there, which we still believe is operative. But we also have this sort of sense that we're not going to let anything get in the way of proclaiming the gospel, and that both men and women, couples, are part of this great house church movement. In the role of Priscilla, we see a woman who is really doing it. And some people say, well, Paul once said, I don't let a woman teach a man. This is in Corinth. And yet Priscilla is teaching Apollos together with her husband. So we see in Acts chapter 2, your sons and daughters will prophesy. And we believe today that it's all hands on deck. And in this house church movement, we are about honoring things like headship and honoring the different roles. And as we develop these house churches, and we have a house church order, which we're going to talk about later in this ordination, it is about reaching the world. It's about bringing revival. It is about getting everyone called by God into ministry, equipped and trained. And there will be differences. In different areas, people will look at some of those passages differently. And we honor the local understanding of some of these differences. And we, even in the faculty, are going to have some of these differences as well. But we open the door for couples, for men and women, for bold leaders, for courageous leaders to go forward and join us in building house churches worldwide. Some of these churches may turn into other size churches, maybe some mega churches. Whatever the Holy Spirit does is fine with us, but we're going to focus on house churches. And this ordination level is about training, accommodation, anointing to be leaders in this house church movement like Aquila and Priscilla. So that if you're a Priscilla, you're Aquila, or you're together in this, I pray that God blesses you as you look at your calling to be part of the house church movement.